Today I'm in conversation with Emma Morgan, partner in the employment team, and Rachel Harvey, senior associate at Shoosmiths, the legal firm. Welcome.
Hi.
What we want to do today is to bust some of the myths around immigration. So, Emma and Rachel, you actually live and breathe immigration. Your life is all about this. You must hear loads of myths. So perhaps if I start with you, Emma, what are the sort of typical myths that you're hearing around immigration?
Well, unfortunately, it tends to be along the lines of how easy it is to get into the UK, which it really isn't. And I think the main problem is at the moment is that employers in particular are finding it very difficult to source the labour that they need, whether that's in the private or the public sector. I think, unfortunately, what was intended to be a sort of condensed routes and more facilitated routes into the UK has now become so complex and difficult that employers are put off bringing people into the UK. And where they do actually bring people in, they're getting tripped up by the existing system. So it really means that we're not getting the right people into the right jobs, and we're also just ending up with further shortages.
Now, isn't one of the salvations of this going to be the Australian point system? We keep hearing about it, and I know throughout the world there are different ways, but the Australian point system is something we're hearing a lot about in the UK. Rachel, tell me a bit about that, and why is that a myth as well, in terms of we've already got some form of point system, haven't we?
So essentially the Australian points-based system is similar to what we used to have for a Tier 1 general visa, which essentially looks at the individual rather than the job that they're going to do. So it looks at their qualifications, their age, their skills, their employment history and what they can bring to the country rather than specifically a role. What we have in the UK is a points-based system, but it's slightly different to that. And the one that employers mostly use to get people to the UK is Tier 2 General, which in itself requires a sponsor licence, so they have to be licensed to be able to sponsor individuals from outside of the EU currently. And they then have to, once they've got their sponsor licence, if they want someone who's not currently in the UK, they have to get a restricted certificate of sponsorship. That, in order to get that, is based on a number of points, based on salary, PhD level jobs get more points, jobs on shortage occupation get more points, and then the migrant themselves, when they put their application in, they have to get a number of points based on whether or not the job has had a resident labour market test done, the fact that they're going to be paid sufficiently in accordance with government guidelines. They get points for having enough money in their bank account and for English language as well.
Wow, so it's very complex.
It's complex.
And how is the system we're hearing about now, the new proposals, different to what we've already got?
Well, it's a good question because you kind of feel like it's a bit of a sticking plaster. So what we end up finding is that Boris and obviously the rest of the cabinet are talking about things that they want to try and bring in. So they're talking about new routes. They even look like in the last week they've announced a kind of like an extension to the exceptional talent route to try and fast track people in science into the UK. So that's one of the routes they're looking at. But if you look at the Australian points-based system as was and where our system was in 2008, there was this category of individual who doesn't necessarily have to have a job offer in the UK. So the idea being if you were a sufficient talent or qualifications or in specific roles, that you could be in demand and therefore have sufficient points in terms of your age, your experience, the job that you hold, and therefore could come into the country without a job offer. But the government, probably 8-9 years ago, decided they didn't like that because the wrong people were staying and ending up working in sort of fast food restaurants and that kind of thing. So they didn't see it as a desirable route. So when you look at the Australian system, what they do is they look at regions, they look at territories, and they also look at roles, and they can cap those specific roles or target specific roles or sectors. So perhaps that is what they're looking at, but it's all up in the air because they've asked the Migration Advisory Committee to look at it once already, and they've asked them to look at it again.
So I think the fact that it's been so complex and they can't find a solution shows that it's a very difficult subject, and our existing system is not fit for purpose, and we hear that from employers all the time. What do you think are the core problems with the existing system? Perhaps, Rachel, you could start.
I mean, I think obviously if this system may be used to sponsor EU migrants after January 2021, it needs a massive overhaul. I think that the process itself is really onerous, not only just to get your licence, but then to carry out a resident labour market test properly. Things such as doing screenshots at the beginning of the advert process, making sure that all of the relevant information is in the advert. Because sometimes what happens is you get to the end of your 28 days advertising and clients come to us and say we want to sponsor someone and they haven't done the adverts properly, so they have to do it all over again. So I think it needs to be clearer. They are talking about maybe abolishing the resident labour market anyway. The actual sponsorship management system is really old-fashioned, it's dated, it's not very easy to use, and I think that trips up a lot of sponsors. Sponsors don't really know what their duties are. They have a significant amount of duties, and I think sometimes they fall short of that because they don't realise that when someone goes on maternity leave, it has to be reported through the system. Even the smallest change in a migrant's circumstance must be reported, and I think they don't know that. So if this is going to be rolled out for Europe as well, it definitely needs some kind of simplification.
Yeah. Okay. And do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think it really is a system which puts employers off. So one of the things recently where clients have said to us, we want to bring in international candidates, and we said, right, well, can we find a way outside of the sponsorship system, because it is so difficult. As a start-up in the UK or an international employer coming into the UK, it's a big expense. So it's not really the actual licence process in terms of the cost of it, but it's the preparation and the infrastructure you need to have in place. But also it's then maintaining it and making sure you have people in place, the processes in place, and then when you want to sponsor anyone, you've got things like the immigration skills charge, you've got NHS charge, you've got the visa fees. So it's whether you or the candidate carries the cost of the visa fees and the NHS charges, you've still got immigration skills charge, which in effect is a bit like the apprenticeship levy. The intention behind it was that the funding, that the employers that need to bring in those skills or those jobs would then in effect be paying a contribution towards something that would be invested in the UK workforce. So it's almost like another tax on employers every time they want to bring in an overseas migrant. So it's all the associated costs. You're looking at 7 to 8 grand each time as a large employer. You want to bring somebody into the UK and you maybe want to sponsor them for up to 6 years, basically.
It sounds like a very torturous process, and for HR departments, obviously there's a lot of paperwork here, lots of complexity. Obviously they can come to specialists like yourselves, but even then it's a huge amount of work.
Yeah.
Are there any pointers you could give to our government and to perhaps governments across the world really in how to simplify some of these types of processes for immigration? Because we know that we do need immigration to enable our workforce to grow, to enable our employers to grow. We don't have enough homegrown people for an awful lot of jobs at the moment. So we need to find a way through this that helps the employers whilst also addressing issues perhaps that the general public have, even though they are often misinformed about some of this. So do you have any thoughts about how we might be able to simplify some of this, or where they should concentrate efforts perhaps to help the employer?
I think one of the things they need to look at, and I think looking at the Australian system, is this regional disparity. So there needs to be some kind of regional variations in terms of skills and shortages and roles, because just because what you tend to find is, unfortunately, the migrants, I hate using that word, but people, economic migrants that come into the UK will focus around big cities, particularly London. But what you want, nurses in Lincoln or, chartered, civil engineers in the Highlands, you're not going to get the same attraction of candidates. So there definitely needs to be some system which allows for this regional variation, and that's certainly something they could take from the Australian system.
Yeah, I agree. I think as well, not setting up employers to fail really.
Yes.
The sponsored guidance is around 283 pages long, and that's not even the right to work policy guidance, which again some employers don't even know exists, and that they should be following that to the letter. So HR departments where immigration isn't their only role, don't have time to go through all of that, and what they don't realise is that if they fall, foul of any of that policy guidance or the right to work policy guidance, it can lead to a fine or losing your licence. And if you lose your licence and you're sponsoring 4 migrants, then those 4 migrants have their visas cut and they have to leave the UK. So I think it's definitely working with employers rather than against them. At the minute, our government puts so much responsibility on employers, not even, this is regardless of whether they're sponsoring people or not, they are immigration officers for the government, essentially. They are having to stop people from working if their visas expire and they haven't renewed them, or not give jobs to people who don't have the right to work. And it's not just employers, it's landlords as well. So it's an extension of the border force, really. And I think what we find, I think, is that it's quite hostile between employers and the UK VI, unless they pay for the £25,000 a year premium sponsor service when they get full access to someone in the Home Office. Otherwise, it's very, very difficult, to make contact with them or get information out of them, and if there's anything which is remotely deviates from the policy, it's just completely banned. Where what we would like to see, I think, is the government and our sponsors working together to try and find solutions to certain skills gaps and things like that.
It certainly seems like the Home Office and the government are making this particularly difficult and almost tripping people up, not necessarily intentionally, but you mentioned an example earlier about that, and I think that we need to find a way that some of this onus is taken back into government and to maybe border control and things like this, rather than the actual employers, as you said, being that sort of front here, because they're just trying to get on with the jobs, create money, pay their tax, help our service and our
and I think the idea being, certainly Migration Advisory Committee has said that the process in terms of licensing and the code of practice and so on does need to be slimmed down in terms of the bureaucracy around all of that. So that's certainly something that's coming out of government. And when we look at things like the EU settlement scheme, and we refer to the lovely Brexit, which we're obviously, it's a topic in itself, the idea behind the EU settlement scheme was, again, to almost give the word preferred, almost to go with the candidate and to give the preferential treatment, I suppose, in a sense, to sort of give them the benefit of the doubt when it came to things like proving settlement. So rather than trying to trip them up, it was almost like an intention that they would be given settled status, or at least pre-settled status, because they need to get on top of this. They can't keep sort of pushing back, and we don't want to end up with another Windrush, because that's the big scary thing that really comes out of the whole Brexit issue, is that to what extent people have been here for 15, 20 years but can't prove their right to work, and if they don't apply for the settlement scheme, what does that mean for them? Because we don't want another Windrush scandal. So there's this presumption, I think, that they're trying to work with candidates, they're trying to work with individuals then applying for settled status, and the presumption being that they will get it. And that's not always the case, and you see a lot in the media about people who didn't get it and why they haven't got it. But it's certainly a step forward in terms of how they're working with employers, with the various agencies, and being much more joined up.
So whether we like it or not, at the moment we are working within the system that there is. What advice can you give to employers? Are you finding any employers putting their sort of head in the sand a bit and perhaps thinking, particularly with the changes coming with the settlement scheme and with Brexit, perhaps thinking this isn't going to apply to us yet or anything? So what advice could you give employers to that they should be starting to think about now, or should even be definitely doing now? Perhaps Rachel would start.
I think we've obviously got a lot of advice out there to our clients to get them prepared well in advance. I think what we did at the beginning with Brexit is make sure our clients knew how much they'd be affected should they have a mass exodus of EU nationals leaving the UK after the referendum vote. So I think that was our first piece of advice. And then the next one, once they announced what was going to happen, the EU registration scheme, was communicate that in a way which shows the staff that you really want to retain them, you really want to make sure that they can stay here for, for the long term. And then now it's almost positioning them for the post-2021 new immigration system, whatever that may be. Obviously, before Boris Johnson came in, there was obviously the white paper was published, and that's subject to a 12-month consultation period. So it's almost taking what we can from that white paper and getting them ready for a time whereby if they want to sponsor an IT programmer who's not already in the UK from Spain, that they potentially have to have a license. And if you're a large organisation, it's fairly easy to sponsor individuals. You've potentially got a dedicated team within your organisation who deals with it all the time. If you're a smaller organisation who relies on overseas, European nationals or whatever, you need to be getting yourself positioned now. Your processes in place to make sure that you are carrying out right to work checks properly. You've got good sickness absence policies in place, just to make sure that if this does go live and everyone does have to have a Tier 2 sponsor licence, that we are ready to support with any kind of application in the future.
I think it's also looking at your existing workforce and working out who you've got and how are you going to retain them, because that's the positive thing for all of this. One of the things the government has been grappling with is how do we find out how many people are actually here, because there was nothing in terms of border control in terms of EU nationals coming in because the borders were open. So I think it's getting a grasp in terms of your own workforce. You never had to track nationality before, and why would you? Because it doesn't really matter. If you've got the right to work, it doesn't matter where you're from. But it's then thinking about your workforce and how you're going to retain them. So in the face of what has been quite a backlash to this free movement, how do we incentivise our existing European workforce to stay with us? And know you have to go through the settlement process, but actually it's not too bad and we'll help support you with that. But also, we want you to stay with us, we want to invest in you. So it's persuading people to stay in the UK and keep the best talent. And as an employer, you don't want to lose that talent or then struggle to, if you lose that talent, you've then got to find it somewhere else. And obviously with the free movement ending potentially when we leave, when and if still at the moment, that potentially, where are we going to get that labour from? We didn't have that ability to recruit in the same way we do now. So it's thinking about the long term. It's not just thinking about, we're all right at the now. And I think some employers are genuinely putting their head in the sand and hoping it's not going to happen. But in terms of your workforce, what you want to be doing is send the message that you're really important to us. We want to keep you, incentivise them, think about that.
And do you think that there's a sort of there's going to be this D-Day in 2021 when suddenly people are like, oh dear, a bit like at the moment we are with potential of a no Brexit, and then everyone's rushing in now to try and do something. If we don't start preparing now,
we're still going to have that now. I think with the government stance at the moment in terms of the end of October, Halloween being we'll fall out of Europe Day. There will be a rush. I think there will be in the next few months. I think people are starting to get worried, aren't they, again? Because
if you have plans to recruit someone who may be arriving in November this year, if we have a no-deal Brexit, that, if they're from Europe, potentially that could affect their future altogether. It may be that they'll come under the new temporary EU scheme, which is what they've decided will happen if we have a no deal. And essentially what that means is people will only be allowed to stay here for 4 years and will have to meet the current immigration system, and that will be enforced. So I think there could be either an influx of people coming before the 31st of October if we are looking at going down a no deal kind of way. But it is just, it's one of those things that employers do little bits when there's a lot of publicity around it, but then when it quietens down, they don't do anything. And already 950,000 EU nationals have applied to the scheme. We have done applications for some of our clients, and what I would recommend is, whoever is eligible now, just to get on and do it, because it is a straightforward exercise that could secure your right to work, your right to live here going forward.
Yeah, so I think people are put off by the fact they've got to go through this process and ask the question, well, why do I have to do it? With the rights and wrongs of it, we may or may not agree with it, but ultimately the process, if you've been here for 5 years or more, and you have a record in terms of, you know, you've worked here full time or whatever it might be for that whole time, you paid your taxes, it's a relatively straightforward process. I appreciate people who've been self-sufficient or have been out of work and so on, it's a bit more complicated, but it's best to, I think in the face of no deal, I think at the moment the preference would be to go forward and get it, because once this new regime comes in, we don't know what this temporary route is going to be until our new immigration system comes in, because it's a bit of a sticking plaster again until we get the new system. So if you're an employer and you're looking to recruit, you want to try and do it before the end of October, and that sounds daft, it's not very long to do it, but at the moment, in face of no deal and the loss of free movement, you know, we have no transition really. And the whole point of transition was to make it easier for employers and everyone to get used to the loss of free movement. But we're faced with that going.
So if you could sum up the types of things you're hearing from your own clients and employers here about the system, what would be the one thing that they would like to see changed, do you think?
I think that it's just made more favourable for employers. Almost don't, all the guidance around, the sponsor guidance, I read a sentence in it the other day, having a sponsor licence is a privilege and not a right.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think basically employers are made to feel that they should be so honoured to have this licence, and that as a result they have to abide by every single sponsor duty, which of course is right. But make it clearer what those sponsor duties are, make it simpler, work with employers rather than against them. And I think that's what our clients would definitely like to see.
Because the problem with the system, as I say, this code of practice has got longer and longer and longer over the years. And if things change, what they often do is stick an addendum at the beginning. So they'll stick an extra couple of pages. So the latest thing is it's been duty to almost act against terrorism on employers, a very subjective duty. And how on earth, as an employer, do you assess that? It's all about tracking and your migrants and making sure you know where they are and that you're not involved in terrorism. But, you know, it's putting duties on employers that they find difficult to understand and for us to even explain to them. But also when the nursing requirements came in, the OSCE requirements in terms of skills and qualifications, that was done as an addendum at the beginning of the code of practice. It was incredibly complicated. And again, the trusts, the private health employers, it felt like it was an extra hurdle to go over in terms of trying to bring migrants into the UK. But ultimately, all of it feels as though we're trying to trip employers up, which it shouldn't really be. But also messages from government like a minimum of £36,000 a year for you to stay in the UK. Well, most nurses are never going to get to that level. But they're the roles that we need to fill in the UK. So I think the mixed messages that employers are getting, they're not really listening to what employers are saying. And the system needs to work with employers so that we get the right people into the right jobs. And, because always business is going to be strangled by it, really.
Great. Well, there's some really good advice there. I think that was a very, very good and interesting conversation. And if we have anybody with any questions after this video webinar, do get in contact with me at the People Space. You can get our details at the end of the video, and we'll try and answer them. And I'll come back to you and see if we can help out some of our HR director readers. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you for watching.